the environment's quite stable. So we can think at the moment with COVID-19, then we're in anything but a stable environment. But where there are less organisational changes going on or less environmental changes occurring, then these kind of heavily structured and organised, more rigid, mechanistic type of structures can work quite well. The opposite to that were what they called more organismic structures, so more like living organisms. So the job functions and roles are much less highly specified. There's a lot more authority at lower levels, so authority is decentralised. People further down the organisational ladder, as we might think of it, can actually take decisions, perhaps at departmental level, some perhaps even on the front line, as we might think of it, or lateral decision making. So it's a more perhaps horizontal kind of organisation where, again, those departmental leaders perhaps interdependent, discuss things and then come to decisions. So knowledge and skills tend to be more equally spread across the organisation in a more organismic structure. So we can think of that in more recent times where we think of more highly skilled workers, perhaps IT type of workers, digital workers, where they bring a lot of skills to an organisation and they would expect to have a little bit more freedom to actually carry out their work using their own expertise and not be dictated to. So these type of more organismic structures are much more kind of open and fluid. They can change and adapt in relation to what's going on in the environment more easily, but it does make coordination much more complex within the organisation. So when we think of those kind of mechanistic structures, we often think of the typical quite bureaucratic, hierarchical type of organisations, some of the big companies, but also things like the civil service, for instance, councils, that type of thing. But in a business sense, these large organisations have tended to be structured either by geography, so for instance Asia Pacific, Europe, Africa and so on, or by function, so a marketing kind of function, an operations management function and so on. By products, so if they've got quite a wide range of products, we might have organisation around, say, baby food versus organisation by adult food and so on. Or it might be a mix of those different kind of types, might be geography and function, for instance. Matrix type organisations have come to the fore again in more recent decades. They are a functional type of organisation, but it's where we've got teams or project groups working, perhaps on a permanent basis or around a temporary basis for a specific project. So we bring people from different functions together to actually work on particular tasks. So you get this kind of metrics or more net like a crisscross type of organisational structure if we start looking at who reports to who. So that can be useful in terms of obviously bringing different types of expertise together. A downside to that is that individual employees in those different teams can find that they have more than one line manager or person to report to. And if there isn't good coordination between those people, perhaps not agreement between those people about how they spend their time, then employees can find that they're pulled in different types of direction in a more matrix type of organisation. So they can work well, but equally they can have complications. Again, in these large kind of quite mechanistic organisations, there are different types of control. And we have what we call U-form organisations where the decision making is much more centralised. So for instance, the executive team decides and cascades decisions to the rest of the business. Now, those centralised or U-form organisations are said to be a superior form of organisation. So having that very centralised control and decision making is superior if the organisation gets savings from economies of scale. So if it's in the area of mass producing something, so produce a lot, the more we produce, the cheaper it is, so the economies of scale, then that centralised decision making can be useful. So that can outweigh the fact that it can be quite costly to have that central executive team deciding on everything. So those more senior, higher paid people, if they've got to make all the decisions, that's quite a costly management process. But if we then get savings because those decisions are rolled out and we mass produce things, then that's where the trade-off is, and we get benefits from that. The opposite of that is the M-form organisation. So M-form in terms of decision making being much more decentralised. So the units, business units, perhaps having a lot more autonomy. And that's said to be superior if we get benefits from that flexibility, and those benefits from being able to make decisions at a more local level exceed the fact that there's likely to be some overlap across those different autonomous units. So we might have a manager in one unit having to kind of decide something, or people in one unit deciding something, and that same decision making process going on elsewhere. So it might be slightly cheaper at the level of who's making the decisions rather than the U form where it's the very senior executive kind of team, but we might get more overlap if we've got autonomous units, and they're quite often then not necessarily coordinating with each other. So it might be what we might call reinventing the wheel a little bit. Now, Henry Mintzberg is a very well-known writer on management, and back in the 80s he suggested there were 5 organisational types, so 5 types of structure back in those days. And he said there was what we would call a simple organisation, and by that he meant quite a small organisation, probably the owner working in the organisation, managing what goes on, and just a small number of employees. So they could make decisions quite quickly, communicate quite easily, didn't need lots and lots of kind of administration and support to do that. The machine bureaucracy refers to those more hierarchical, mechanistic type of organisations, whether they're in the public sector or the private sector. This idea of something working like a well-oiled machine, that actually came from the German civil service, Max Weber's work in the civil service. And it was about everybody knowing exactly what their job role was, everybody knowing what the reporting lines were, and therefore, although there were lots of steps within decision-making processes, they would be quite slick and not interfere overly with getting things done. The professional bureaucracy is similar to a machine bureaucracy, but it's one where the organisation is dominated by professional employees. And it refers to professionals as we used to think of them some years ago, being mainly in those days perhaps lawyers, doctors, those type of people who were in NHS or within private kind of firms, but they really dominated the workforce. So they were very highly educated, knowledge-based professionals, versus perhaps manufacturing type of organisations which could run like the machine bureaucracy, because the level of knowledge, the level of intellect tended to be higher at the higher levels in a machine bureaucracy. It tended to sit with the leaders and the managers. In the professional bureaucracy, where we now do tend to have in hospitals, for instance, both professional groups like doctors and nurses and managers, professional managers who've come in, and they may be all quite well educated kind of groups, but the service is delivered in those instances in a hospital. The service is delivered by the professionals themselves, so the doctors, the nurses, the radiographers and so on. Divisionalized forms are those types of, again, mechanistic kind of structure, and it might be a divisional business unit according to geography or product or so on. And then we've got what we call more adhocracies. And these are, in a way, similar to professional bureaucracies. There's quite high levels of knowledge and intellect within an adhocracy, but they're usually more boutique, smaller types of organisations where there's a lot of creativity and where things are driven very much by those kind of professionals working there. So in relation to all these different types, Mintzberg suggested there were these different aspects of the organisation. So the strategic apex is what I'm referring to as the senior leaders and the managers. We've then got the middle line, so the middle line managers who come between this, perhaps the strategic executive team, and what he called the operative core or the frontline workers within any organisation. They might be departmental managers, so they might be business managers, or they might be just more people-oriented line managers. So we've got the three kind of aspects of the pyramid there in terms of the levels or the hierarchy, and that was supported by the technostructure, so the very technical, we might think of the kind of the IT, digital skills type of group within an organisation, might be finance as well. And then we've got the support staff, so the administrative staff who support all these different levels, the strategic level and right down towards the operating core. Okay, so we've thought about five quite traditional types of organisational structure as Henry Mintzberg informed everyone. Now, organisations obviously will start from being quite simple organisations at start-up, when an entrepreneur comes along with an idea, decides to set up a small business, and then that business gradually grows over time. And Larry Greiner has talked about the stages of growth, and he talks about evolution and periods of revolution within organisations in terms of their life cycle. And he suggests there are 5 phases of growth, and these are dictated obviously by the external circumstances as well that an organisation faces, so the environment that it's operating in, how easily it allows an organisation to grow, or perhaps challenges growth. We're thinking again, if we think about COVID-19 and many small organisations that are perhaps struggling to survive or are going to go out of business if they've not gone out of business already due to the economic kind of impact of COVID-19. So there are external situations which will impact, but age and maturity. So we tend to have traditionally seen that young organisations start out quite small in terms of size. So we're looking here at age along the bottom. What we call the x-axis going across, and on the y-axis we're looking at size of organisation. So a young organisation usually starts out quite small. There's lots of creativity there, and probably an entrepreneur has got creative ideas at the start, and that's why they come to set it up. And at that point of leadership, it's usually that entrepreneur, that owner, who is quite heavily involved with gradually a small group of people, and hopefully that organisation, that business starts to then grow, starts to sell its product or services, and will gradually then expand, usually looking to increase share of the market, increase sales, and so on. So as that organisation starts to grow, and then it's getting a little bit older, usually we find then that growth within the organisation, as we start to get more employees on board, we might start to produce more products or offer more services, and suddenly more direction is needed for the organisation. And that can be then we need the leaders to actually kind of step in and decide. It might be that they need to appoint a specific business manager or more managers to actually give that direction. And then over time, often there's another bit of a crisis of leadership there as to actually that direction sometimes then starts to become a little bit too much, starts to constrain the organisation a little bit. The organisation's becoming more mature, it's still kind of growing, it's hopefully doing well, and it really is about time now for a little bit more delegation down the levels of the organisation. So we've inevitably started to put in more management structures and more formalised line management processes. But then as that starts to constrain things a little bit, we perhaps need some delegation. And there's this kind of crisis here, this leadership point about relinquishing some of the control and giving that back to lower level managers and to employees perhaps further down the organisation. And then we can find that perhaps we that organisation spreads out, it develops other kind of units or business kind of sectors or what have you, and we've got this need then to try and kind of coordinate everything better that's going on within the organisation. And we can start to find then that we get increasing kind of red tape coming back into the organisation. So we're getting here relinquishing some control, the need to then kind of coordinate again. We can run into problems with red tape and bureaucracy, again, as the organisation's growing and it's been around for longer. The longer it's been around, the more processes tend to get put in place, so the more bureaucratic it becomes. And we come to a point then that really to actually kind of shift, and it's argued that this is where a lot of big organisations are at this stage of needing to collaborate. So to really kind of grow further, it can be thinking about more strategic partnerships and alliances. So how it can really kind of maximise its own offering and its way of adding value by perhaps collaborating or forming partnerships with others. And again, this is where then leaders need to be able to kind of involve themselves in those kind of partnerships and let go of some of their kind of hold on certain things. So this is what's seen as here in a linear fashion, but Grinder acknowledges that this is not necessarily going to be linear. We might start small, creative organisations, they might grow a bit, we might start to delegate, things might happen and we might need to kind of pull back to give him more direction. The organisation might not grow so much, might contract, for instance, in terms of what's going on in the environment that it's operating in. So we shouldn't expect that this is going to be moving from stages 1 to 5 without any kind of disruptions in between. But we can probably think about some of the kind of small creatives. We can think about some organisations that are up here that might be needing to think about being much more creative and collaborating with other partners, sometimes people who've been competitors in the past, in order to be able to take their organisational kind of growth and their survival and their strategy to the next level. Now, another quick recap from last year in organisations in a global environment. You talked about harder versus softer structural types, and thinking about these this is the efficient, bureaucratic, so machine bureaucracy type of organisation or professional bureaucracy organisation, very much focused on efficiency and performance, tended to have a vertical structure, routine tasks, lots of formal systems that have come into place over the years, a well-defined competitive strategy, and often a culture that's quite rigid because it's been embedded over a number of years. And we've seen this kind of push to shift some of that in order to be more adaptive, have a more adaptive culture, as I said at the bottom here. And as information flows have started to increase around the globe, and we've moved towards this idea of learning organisations, the organisations that are able to adapt quite quickly to different circumstances that they face in the environment, are less rigidly structured. There's more equality, so more horizontal structures where there's equality amongst different kind of departments and teams. Employees are more empowered, so they can take more decisions themselves. Things tend to happen in networks, so the networks that people form are seen as very valuable and encouraged. A much more collaborative strategy. So I talked about level 5 of organisations and about collaboration on the last slide, Greiner's 5 phases of growth. So these more learning organisations will tend to be much more focused on collaboration, and that will be internally amongst departments as well as externally with perhaps people they might have once seen as competitors, or just different types of stakeholders who they can now partner with. So it makes them much more adaptable overall. So we've seen this kind of idea that some of this kind of efficient, rigid kind of structures are not always suitable for adaptation that's needed in today's world. And this idea of the learning organisation has come to the fore. So this is where we start to think about what we might think of as newer forms of organisational structure and newer structural types. So learning organisation I've just mentioned on the previous slide, and in week 5 we'll look a little bit more at that, about knowledge management and learning organisations. And some examples are 3M, 3M, massive company, American company who own things like Scotch tape, 3M Scotch tape, as well as a whole host of different kind of health companies and a range of things. An IBM computer company, which I'm sure everybody's familiar with. We've seen talk of boundaryless organisations. So one thing about organisational design and organisational structures, where we have quite rigid structures, and where we can say an organisation is organised by division or function or so on, we've got very, very clear boundaries about who is a member of that organisation, who's a member of which department, which team, and so on. But we've seen a shift to this greater fluidity. So 2 types of what are known as boundaryless organisations are talked about as modular organisations, and that's when all but the most essential functions are outsourced. So all the maybe administrative functions, HR functions, those kinds of things are outsourced. And Toyota is an example of that. Partnerships I've talked about might be partnerships across competitive lines. So for instance, Starbucks and PepsiCo formed an alliance where Starbucks would develop certain drinks that they were, or certain types of drinks for PepsiCo where they had particular expertise, and that allowed them to actually kind of start to shift and build reputation and market share in that area as well. We've got what we might call networked organisations. So again, these flatter organisations based around communities or social networks. And so seen as much more agile, agile as in able to respond more quickly, take decisions more quickly, and that decision making at the lower levels, so much less hierarchical, and very kind of community based. We've got what we might call virtual or digital organisations, and these might be seen as networks as well. So they are social networks really, organised through digital online means, online communities. And some companies that work in this way are Nike, Puma, and Dell Computers. And then we've got self-managed teams, sometimes called autonomous working teams. The idea of self-managed teams has come to the fore in recent years, but it's not a particularly new idea. It's been around since the 1950s. We've seen work by the Tavistock Institute in London talking about looking at coal mining and looking at the way that miners actually used to mine coal and how they worked really as teams, and they were quite autonomously organised. And when management was put into that situation with the aim of making that whole process more efficient, it actually didn't work. It actually disrupted the social kind of connection between those workers and the way that they'd actually worked everything out amongst themselves. So self-managed or autonomous working teams are not particularly new, but interest in them has come to the fore again. And there is a podcast on companies without managers in additional resources within week 1. And we'll refer to that when we start talking a little bit more about teams as well. So have a listen to that about some quite interesting examples of a healthcare team which rotates leadership around amongst its members from week to week, and companies where they've effectively done away with really rigid kind of management structures.